Raffine really is one of the most frustrating cards you could play against currently in Standard, and it is definitely the card that most represents the current metagame that we're in. Welcome back to Ew, where I break down everything wrong with specific Magic the Gathering card, and today we're obviously taking a look at Raffine. If you don't know what Raffine does, which is almost impossible if you've touched Standard at all, Raffine is a 3-mana 1/4 with flying and ward 1. Whenever you attack, target attacking creature connives X, where X is the number of attacking creatures, and conniving is draw X cards, then discard X cards, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature for each non-land card discarded this way. Now there are many variations of Esper in Standard, but they all play Raffine. Here's an example of a deck I've played recently that is able to leverage Raffine thanks to the incredible early game flyers that you have access to. Now, if you've watched my previous video on everything wrong with Schooner, you'll notice that Raffine falls into the same kind of design trap that Schooner does, except this time we're taking it to another level. The fundamental problem with Raffine is tied to snowballing, a concept where the player that is ahead will keep pushing their advantage and keep the snowball rolling, putting your opponent further and further behind. Now, this concept, when it comes to card design, has to be approached very carefully because Magic fundamentally has a play-draw problem that can further emphasize the snowballing effect of early game spells. This adds a level of randomness into the game on top of the 50-50 coin flip for play-draw, where your opponent will need to find specific answers in time to answer those snowballing effects. And this is why the concept of snowballing permanents that are cheap are just very difficult to balance in general. And if you are going to create cards that do have this impact on the game, you have to make sure that they are relatively easy to answer, and that their snowballing effect is tied to potential restrictions or maybe a stat line that is less impactful. And when you look at Raffine, you can see a 3-mana 1/4 with flying. That is already really solid stats. It's really good on offense because it has flying, and it's pretty good on defense as well because it has a lot of toughness. And further playing into the play-draw problem, we have one aspect of the card that I truly don't understand how that came to be. It's the addition of Ward 1, which means that your opponents targeting Raffine will have to pay 1 extra mana to remove it. This creates another mana sink and a mana disparity between you and your opponent, where if you're on the play, you hit your turn 3 first, which means you hit 3 mana first, while your opponent is still on 2 mana, and to remove this immediately, they can only do that with a 1 mana spell, which creates a mana vacuum again, which is a huge advantage in Magic the Gathering, and is one of the reasons why play draw is a problem in the first place, because you have access to more mana if you play first. With the Ward 1, it means that your opponent will have even more problems to recover in terms of tempo because they're going to have to spend potentially an entire turn to remove Raffine, whereas you can keep pushing your advantage by playing more and more threats that eventually they will just fall too far behind. So let's kind of expand on how exactly Raffine snowballs the game. Obviously, I talked about the stat line, which is really solid on this creature, and then obviously we have the effect where whenever you attack with anything, no matter if it's Raffine or not, an attacking creature can connive X, and connive does allow you to put more stats on that creature, or potentially go through your cards trying to find specific answers, potentially ditching your lands, gaining higher card quality over your opponent. And that is an aspect of snowballing. Whether you're giving another creature stats, or you're filtering through cards to try to find more pressure to put on your opponents, or trying to find the right answer for the current situation. An issue that's tied to this is the fact that since Raffine doesn't have to attack to activate this effect, the problem with Raffine is that it amplifies the power level of early game creatures. So the higher power level the format when it comes to early game, the more impactful Raffine is going to be, because potentially you might have to answer those 2 drops and then also have to answer Raffine, and then potentially have to answer a 4-drop behind that, which means that your opponent has to draw so many removal spells that eventually they will just run out or not have enough removal spells early. As I said, the keyword is early enough to stop you from using those snowballing effects. For example, we have the Bat that comes in on turn 2 that most people will need to answer. We also have Schooner that is incredibly good with Raffine, obviously. So in theory, a 3-color mana cost should be difficult to cast in Standard. And that ties directly into the balance of Raffine. Now, when we talk about balance, I'm assuming that with the 3-color mana cost, the concept behind Raffine was that you would have to take a hit to your mana, meaning you can play less early game in general to take advantage of the snowballing, and potentially just not be able to play Raffine on turn 3 due to the mana restrictions, which is definitely not the case in Standard, and that's where the problem lies, that this card can come down on turn 3 pretty much every single game. And as I mentioned before, with a card that doesn't need to attack, we have a huge problem where the effect is so powerful the further you are ahead, because Raffine just can come off the top and impact the board in that way, or impact your hand in that way, where you get a huge connive, potentially find what you need in that exact situation, and or just potentially scale up a creature to very high levels. So what could we have done to balance Raffine? Well, number one is pretty simple. I think that Raffine's effect should probably be tied to it itself attacking, which would give the card less impact on the battlefield immediately, and also play into the fact that you would have to lose Raffine on blocks if you wanted to gain its effect, meaning that your opponent has an angle to attack you back. This step alone might be enough to balance the card. If we were to leave the effect as it is, I think we would definitely have to remove the Ward 1, and potentially change Raffine's stats to be much weaker, something like 1-3 maybe, to put it more in reach with red removal spells, for example, and overall just give it less blocking power. Now, with the first change, I do think that Raffine would be a lot less impactful and give your opponent more time to find answers for it, and also lessen the burden on the player that is on the draw, where they won't have to deal with like a 1-drop and a 2-drop into Raffine, where everything gets out of control way too quickly for them. It would also lessen the impact of Raffine as a top deck, which I think is pretty relevant for a card that has an effect this powerful. If you were to compare Raffine to, in my opinion, a really well-designed card, it would have to be Talion's Messenger. Talion's Messenger is a 3-mana 1-3 with flying, and whenever you attack with one or more fairies, draw a card, then discard a card. When you discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on target fairy you control. And what I appreciate about this card is that it does have a light snowballing effect tied to it. You have the looting, and you have the +1/+1 counter. But much different from Raffine is that it has no protection, so no ward. Its stats are much more reasonable, but I do think this card could possibly just be a 1-4 and match Raffine's stats. And in this case, this card can pretty much only see play in fairies. So it has a deck building restriction, which I think is very important for cards that are going to be powerful in the format. I think you'd want your most powerful cards to be restricted to a very certain specific deck, right? So that way they're not just playable in every single deck of that color. So you have to put some thought into what deck you want to build if you want to play a specific card. One major problem with cards like Raffine is that they divert attention potentially away from themselves onto other creatures. So if you put the stats onto another creature that is also a threat, well, your opponent has to potentially answer that threat first before answering Raffine, further pushing your advantage. And if you have more threats that can follow up Raffine, it can potentially alleviate their risk of getting removed as well. So the more powerful the meta, the more cards you have to destroy, the more problematic those cards are. At the end of the day, Raffine has many problems. One is that it's a cheap creature. It is very impactful as a top deck, and on turn 3, pretty much at any position where you do have creatures on the field, and even when you don't, honestly. And it also has self-protection, further promoting the problem that is play draw, and creating a game state that quickly gets out of control. And that is going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to check out my other videos, on cards that I covered in this series, go ahead and do so. I also have another series about the art of card design where I talk called The Art of Card Design, where I go over the cards that are extremely well designed and cards that I overall appreciate a lot in the game. Anyways, thank you for watching. Don't forget to click the subscribe button as well as the notification bell if you want to keep up with my content. And if you want other ways to support me, you can always join the YouTube membership program for my channel, or you can join my Patreon where I have a bunch of video guides. Anyways, I appreciate all the support, and I'll see you all in the next video.